Doom. You know that game, right? The guy who likes smashing in the skulls of demons.
Here's your receipt, sir. Will there be anything else?
Today we will not be talking about the game, but actually the producer of the Doom soundtrack. Let's start with a little backstory. Doom. Almost all of you weren't even born at that time when the game was released. Doom 2 is like the original but better. Doom 3 is a horror spin-off of the previous Doom games. But then Doom 2016 would come around and return the game to its original roots from Doom 1 and 2 with fast-paced and open-area combat. And now in 2020, Doom Eternal came out, which is Doom 2016 but better. The Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal are great successes, but behind the scenes something was bubbling underneath the surface. And now we're gonna talk about today's subject, Mick Gordon, the game's composer. Nick came out recently in Twitter with a document saying that the recent soundtrack he did for Doom Eternal was a fucking nightmare, saying he was mistreated, and when he finished the soundtrack he was offered a 6-figure hush money to take the blame and act like nothing had happened. To give a little more backstory with the drama, this all started back at 2020 with id Software director Marty making a post on Reddit stating that it wasn't anyone's fault that the soundtrack was delayed except for Mick Gordon. Basically, reading through the post, it paints Mick Gordon as someone who doesn't like working with the higher ups in the company. He also stated that Mick would move dates around, and when promised a permanent fixed deadline, he will miss it. And he even stated that the music he made wouldn't even meet expectations of Doom or Mick's fans, which leads to id Software hiring different composers to finish the soundtrack. And when the soundtrack was finished, he says that the only concern of Mick was about getting full credit and not giving other people credit for patching up his work. Basically, this Reddit post paints Mick as a complete asshole, with Mick even saying in Twitter now that his career is ruined, and saying that no one wants to work with him because they think he's a complete asshole. To think he was offered hush money after his career was essentially ruined is just a slap in his face. This document also lists all the things that id didn't provide for him. An example is that when he was making a soundtrack, he was only given concept art and wasn't given any gameplay footage to base the soundtrack around. But the reason he wasn't given any gameplay footage was because the Doom Eternal build was still too unstable to record in. If you still don't understand what's wrong with not given footage of gameplay when making a soundtrack, let me give you an example. Try making Minecraft music, but the only thing you were given is a picture of Steve, a sheep, and a tree. Another thing that Mick was talking about in this document was the crunching he had to do, and if he had missed a single deadline, another project would have to be delayed. It's a vicious cycle, and making failure not an option. Mick knew the situation was bad, so he talked to the higher ups in id Software and basically suggested he would make generalized musics for now until the game starts taking shape. That's when he'll make more specific music, because he was at the moment supposed to make 2 levels worth of music in a single month. But what Marty's response to Mick Gordon's reasonable suggestion? Well, he fucking ignored it. So generally, Mick had to work on a soundtrack with just concept art and text, and was pulling all-nighters at the office, sleeping underneath his desk to meet deadlines, and when he presents the work to id, they would say it's not good and to try again. What's worse is that in E3 2019, Doom Eternal was announced with a collector's editions containing the Doom Eternal soundtrack, even though the soundtrack wasn't even finished. And pre-orders were on sale immediately, so people were buying something that doesn't even exist. Mick, obviously, was absolutely terrified about this, because he suddenly has a lot of pressure put onto him. So he messaged Marty and said, "How are you making people pay for something that doesn't even exist?" And Marty said in response was to stop causing distractions. And to top it all off, Mick was sent a draft from Bethesda to make 12 songs, and they have final approval, and the deadline was on April 16. So essentially, he had a month to produce 12 songs, and Bethesda could reject these songs if they weren't on the Bethesda standards. But the reason why Bethesda slammed Mick was because there is a thing called consumers' rights, and they realized that if they sold the collector's edition with no soundtrack, everyone who bought the collector's edition is entitled to a refund. But no worries, Mick. Bethesda thought to speed up the process, they would hire an in-house guy called Chad Mossholder to fix up the soundtrack and patch up some holes Mick has left behind. But the worst thing is that Chad sucks at his job and doesn't do the work properly, only copy and pasting previous tracks without even adding crossfade between the music. And to top off the shit cake, Chad Mossholder was credited as if he did 50% of the work that Mick mostly did on his own. In the end, Mick, as I told before, was offered a 6-figure hush money to shut up and take the blame for all the wrongdoings and say that everything was all his fault and the company was not part of the delay of the soundtrack and was also not allowed to talk about the company. In the end, he said no and to go to hell with the deal. But at the end of the day, he was defamed and blamed for something he had no control over. Marty painted Mick as a complete asshole, even though he did the work he was asked to do so. I hope in the end of this video you understand how Mick struggled and practically got his career nuked because of unreasonable deadlines and nearly unreachable goals with the time frame he was given.